So here we are. We're about halfway through the season of Epiphany, which follows the day of Epiphany and goes right up until when Lent starts on Ash Wednesday, which, in case you already have it marked, is March 5th this year. So we should be kind of starting to figure out this Epiphany thing. Because, the thing about that word, Epiphany, we fill it with all kinds of mystery. Like, I've had this revelation, it's earth-shattering, eureka, right? But in the simplest sense, Epiphany just means showing. That's actually what the Greek means. So Epiphany is a time when we are being shown something, what something is or how it's meant to be seen. Kind of like, we're shining a flashlight onto something, we're like, this, right here, pay close attention, check it out. So the gospel lessons across the entire season of Epiphany are chosen to show us something. And that something is the power and the love of God that has come to us in the person of Jesus. So, all through Epiphany, bit by bit, those gospel readings show us more and more about who Jesus is and what Jesus does. So, over the past month of Sundays, we've been shown that Jesus has been recognized as the long hoped for Messiah. And we have been shown that Jesus speaks with the Word of God. And we have been shown that Jesus manifests God's power and love in miraculous ways, like turning water to wine. And we have also been shown that God has a kingdom of love and justice that's prepared and open for all who hear and respond to Jesus. Yet, you may not have noticed it, but there's another thread that has woven its way through our Epiphany readings. It's in the epistles. Because we have been working our way through Paul, who has been showing us week by week who we are meant to be as disciples of Christ. Paul said, guess what? You are called to be members of a body, the body of Christ. And you've all been given a gift and a role in this whole. So we've been shown who Jesus is, and we've been shown who we are called to be as his followers. And it seems as if this week in our readings is when those two threads are woven together. Because what does the gospel show us about God and Jesus? Well, precisely what Paul has been telling us for weeks now. That Jesus is calling us, human beings, into the work of the unfolding of the kingdom. And that God's working through us to make God's power and love known and felt everywhere in all the earth. So today we get these 3 calling stories that show us all kinds of different ways that calling into ministry can happen and how it tends to unfold in lots of different ways for what are basically we unsuspecting human beings. So we get Simon, later known as Peter, but here still Simon, the Galilean fisherman. Now, we don't know this, and at least not from the perspective of lectionary, because we skipped it, but Simon has actually seen firsthand Jesus' miraculous power, because Jesus came to his home and healed his mother-in-law. Yet, do you think that he knew what was coming when Jesus commandeered his boat as this, impromptu podium? I don't think he saw it coming. Because Jesus invites him out to fish, and Simon's first reaction is skeptical. We're tired, Jesus. We have been out there. There are no more fish to be caught. You might have noticed that God never seems to call upon us for the easy stuff, does God? I was just having this conversation with Sally after church. We never get the things that we think, yeah, God, got that. No problem. God seems to expect more than we think is possible. It's a thing. But despite Simon's cynicism, he relents. He says, that'll be worth it, Jesus, but you know what? If you say so, I will try. Now that is not exactly the kind of enthusiastic response that you would hope for if you were trying to lead a team into a new project, is it? No. Yet when all those fish start filling up those nets, Simon's doubts turn to amazement and also fear. Now, why is he afraid, you might ask? Well, the classic answer is that he recognizes all of a sudden, I am in the presence of God. Now, why he didn't notice that when Jesus came to his house and healed his mother, I'm not sure, but he's clearly taken off guard here. And he could see it as something that's dangerous and frightening. But I think there's more behind Simon's fear. And I think it's the kind of thing that all of us can relate to when we figure out that God has something for us to do. Because I think maybe it's only at this moment when the fish are overloading those nets and they're trying desperately to haul them into the boats that Simon realizes that Jesus intends to turn his life upside down. And that Jesus has miraculous work to do through him, through Simon. And that somehow Simon's just got to figure out how he's going to come along for that ride. He's got to keep saying, not just this once, but over and over again, if you say so, Jesus, I will give it a try. And that's hard. That's a real loss of control in your life. So, Simon, first model of discipleship, a frightened skeptic who can only manage an unenthusiastic, if you say so, yet he still manages to leave everything and follow Jesus. So then we have Paul. Now, Paul is the all-time most valuable player in church mission. I mean, at least from the perspective of the Bible, we have more of Paul's writings than anybody else's in the New Testament, and we learn all about all of the different churches that Paul founded across the known world. Now, you would think, oh, I wish that could be me. Would that God's gifts could be so fruitful in us. Yet, here in today's letter, piece of the letter to the Christians in Corinth, Paul is saying, I was not necessarily the obvious choice for this job. And that you guys, you got to think about yourselves differently too. He calls upon people to not lose sight of the most important thing. That just like Jesus died and was raised for us, God is creating resurrection in everybody all the time. And that's how God does amazing things through us. And Paul offers himself as an example. He's a great example of this. And he is the first to admit, I was a rotten choice. I was unfit to be called into service of Jesus and the mission of love, because I was in fact the worst enemy of all of that. I was an enemy of the church. So how could God expect someone with such a reputation to successfully spread the gospel in the world? Well, it worked. It happened. See, Paul says, just like God turns sin into salvation, so God takes even we humans and our selfishness and our malice and all of the worst things that we can conjure up, and he transforms them, changes them, resurrects us into new people who can complete the work of the kingdom here on earth. So Paul, worst choice ever, Simon, fearful and kind of tepid, if you say so, God. 2 models of response to this call. So, just to make sure that we get it right, the lectionary put in Isaiah, which is the classic, like, here's what you're supposed to say. Here I am, send me, right? I have to say, though, Isaiah's kind of hard for me to relate to because it's a bit too clean. God says jump, and Isaiah just says how high, right? I mean, you can kind of get why they always read this reading at ordinations. But I have to say, I've been preaching on the 5th Sunday in Epiphany a long time. And I still prefer what we used to read in the old BCP lectionary on this Sunday, which was the calling of Gideon. Now, Gideon is a completely different story from Isaiah because throughout the receiving and following of his call, Gideon feels so much more real and human to me. Gideon tests God over and over again, and Gideon remains, I'm sure, right to the very end. Gideon, not that different from Peter and Paul and many of us, when faced with God's call, sees first and foremost his own deficiencies. He says, I can't do it. I'm not the right person, and guess what? No one's going to listen to me. Yet Gideon, for all his skepticism, is not even ready to say what some of these other people said. You know, I doubt it, but if you say so, I'll go along with you, God. Gideon is in another place entirely because he doubts that God's even still acting on behalf of his people at all. He effectively looks at God and says, where have you been lately, God, and what have you done? Because those Midianites, they are about to destroy us. See, Gideon's not even sure that God is still with him, even when they're sitting there meeting face to face. Well, God gives last response that you would expect or want to hear when asking that kind of question of total despair, because God says to Gideon, guess what? I empower you, Gideon. You can go out and fix it. That is not what you want to hear. You want God to fix it for you, right? So does Gideon just effectively drop his nets and follow? Oh, no. Gideon keeps challenging God. He says, yeah, God, you got to prove it. I'm not doing anything until you prove it. Any human leader would give up on this guy and tap someone else for the job, don't you think? But God's patient, what we would call non-reactive, and he allows Gideon to keep on testing him, not just in this passage, but over and over and over again. And I don't know how many of you remember from Sunday school, because we don't usually get the whole Gideon story in Sunday school. We just get the exciting ending. When Gideon and a mere 300 Israelites send the Midianite army fleeing across the Jordan into chaos by blasting their horns and crashing hundreds of glass jars in the night. They make them think that they're just this giant host, and the Midianites get freaked out and they run away. So you would think, oh, he finally got there. Gideon trusted God and he was willing to go with God's plan. But even on the night of that battle, Gideon is still portrayed as seeking signs of reassurance and assurance that God's with him. It's there with him for his whole time. So, can you see something of yourself in any of these stories that we've talked about today? We get 4 of them. 3, I'm not sure, God, and 1, well, here I am. Send me. They're all good models of discipleship, clearly. God doesn't just call the Isaiahs of this world. And if God can use Simon, a frightened skeptic, or Paul, a zealot enemy of the church, or Gideon, who never gives up his doubt, surely God can use each and every one of us too. So, looping back to the beginning, what do all of these stories show us about God and Jesus? Well, clearly they show us that Jesus calls humans into the work of the unfolding of the kingdom, and that God works through us to make God's power and love known and felt on the earth. They also let us know how God and Jesus choose to work through even the most human of all of us, and that when we meet God, it's not always easy. It can go all kinds of different ways, and God is open to all of our reactions. And finally, they show us that even if we're plagued with doubt, we should never, ever forget that God is there working in us and through us, bringing that kingdom together, person by person, day by day. So, our book of occasional service is full of commissioning services. They got one for every ministry that they could possibly think of, and that you can create even more if you need them. Are some of you familiar with commissioning, the Book of Common Prayer commissioning services at all? You know what I mean? A couple of you. You know, if you're gonna, like, say for example, we had acolytes and we trained them, then we would commission them, and they all have this similar format. They ask you a question, which is basically, you ready to do the job? Here's the job, you ready for it? And the response is written in. It's scripted. It's just one thing. It says, I will. Essentially. But today I wanna challenge us all to think of something that God's calling us into, or something that we have started into with God, or we are continuing to walk with God, and it continues to be a struggle for us. And think about the question, you've been called to be disciples of Christ, and to let God work through you in a unique way. Will you try and do as best you can?
I will.
You will? Good. Does someone want to say, if you say so, God? Any if you say so's?
Yeah.
How about any, why me, God? I've heard some of those recently. Any, I'm not the best choice?
Oh yeah.
Okay. How about, I'm afraid, God? Because that's okay too. And even, prove it, God. All that. Just embrace it. Be in conversation with God. Keep listening and keep responding. Amen.